Hi, I'm Andrew Hoffman, Executive Director of NeighborLink Fort Wayne, and welcome to Neighboring, a series where we ask our friends and neighbors, what does it mean to be a good neighbor? In a day and age where we're trying to figure out what does it mean to be a good neighbor, a good person, what it means, what it doesn't, we thought it would be a great idea to sit down with a wide variety of people and ask them the question, what does it mean to be a neighbor? And today we're here with Ed Fenstermacher, the ultimate neighbor, the neighbor, the Mr. Rogers neighbor that you know. And so we want to take some time. Ed and I are neighbors. We've been neighbors for about 10 years now, and I'm so excited that you're here, Ed. Would love for you to introduce yourself, take some time to talk about who you are, what you do, and the neighborhood that you live in.
Okay, well, I'm Ed Fenstermacher, and I live in the Williams Woodland Park Neighborhood Association. I have been there for 34 years now, and I work for the United Methodist Church in the area of church development. I'm not a pastor, but I hang around with pastors an awful lot. So I do work in the area of helping churches be more effective at carrying out their mission, as well as helping start new faith communities.
All right. Well, tell us about Williams Woodland. Tell us about the neighborhood that you, your wife, and your family live in.
It is an amazing place, and I can say that because I've experienced other places, and for us it's been a real joy to live there. I at one point was working out of Marion, and at the times people were wondering if we were going to move to Marion, and I actually decided not to because our neighborhood was so important to us as we were raising our three sons. And it was such a unique place, a place of community, a place that I belonged to and was a neighbor to others, and others were neighbors to us. I just didn't want to leave that place, so it's a special place.
Well, when I was thinking about this series, this idea of neighboring, you know, we really thought that the first guest, when we talk about neighboring, we really think about neighborhoods and the places that we live as being kind of the quintessential place that we call home as being the neighborhood. And so because of our work in NeighborLink, where we're trying to connect vulnerable homeowners to neighbors that are interested in helping them to serve through tangible needs, we thought it would really just be a great spot to start with the neighborhood. And fortunately, we live in a really great neighborhood where there's a lot of neighbors like yourself that take a lot of time and interest in the place that they live. Curious, why did you and your wife and your family choose Williams Woodland 30 years ago?
Actually, because the job that brought me to Fort Wayne required that I live in the neighborhood. Okay. So part of the deal was you're working for the church down the street, the time Simpson United Methodist Church. I was on the staff there, and they wanted me to be a part of the community and actually live in the community. So they owned a home, the home that we now own. So I rented that for the first 3 years that I was in the neighborhood.
So that's part of church culture, or in some cases where you got assigned to a particular area, a particular church, particular neighborhood, and they invited you and said, this is kind of part of your work. Mm-hmm. At the time, how did you and your wife feel about that? Was that a choice that just came natural, or was there some resistance? Had you guys decided or wanted to live anywhere else?
Well, actually, at the time, I wasn't married, so okay. My wife had no say in that at that point. Later on, we had to mutually decide to live there, but it was really due to the fact that part of my job was connecting with the community, and you can't do that very well unless you live in the community. So that was part of the intention, and I needed a place to stay anyway. It's a beautiful neighborhood, so I didn't have any reservation.
Talk to me more about the idea of proximity. You mentioned that, part of it was being in and part of the community. What role do you feel like proximity plays in the whole idea or concept of neighboring in general?
Well, I think that the reality is we can't be a true neighbor in the fullest sense unless we live in the neighborhood. I know of people who have done ministry in neighborhoods, in fact, my own neighborhood, but they don't live there. And they don't have the same relationship as I do being a resident of that neighborhood. As much as they would love to be a part of the neighborhood and connect with the neighbors, even though they do a fine job of that, they still are limited because they're not a resident of the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. They're coming from outside. And I think that that's just a part of being in a community. If you don't live in the community, if you're not a part of the community, then I think it becomes somewhat of a barrier.
Do you think that's just on an individual level, or do you also think of that from like outside groups or businesses that may have an interest in transforming a particular area, whether it's faith-based or not? How do you see that playing out besides like an individual that has an interest in seeing a neighborhood transform?
I think for me, when I'm approached or when an organization from outside the neighborhood comes in and is interacting, my initial response or thought is that I'm just, in a sense, an object to them. That for whatever reason they've chosen to come into the neighborhood because they see some kind of value in doing that will benefit them. And I think that it's not fair to them, but I think I have some prejudices or preconceived notions as to their motivations, which may not be true at all. But I tend to feel like they see me as someone that they're going to meet and they won't remember my name next week because they're gone. They're out of the neighborhood. And so without a relationship, there's not a whole lot of value. There's not a lot of incentive in developing a relationship, in my mind.
Yeah, I remember personally, like to that point about 10 years ago when Michelle and I, my wife and I, were looking at moving into the neighborhood, and this was very much an intentional choice and a decision for us. Like we were volunteering and serving and coming in and out, very transactional, where we were using NeighborLink and some other things that we were serving in to identify people that needed help through traditional sources. And so the way volunteerism is, you kind of drive across town and you help someone and you interact, and then you go back and we started realizing that there was a disconnect between, like that became hard, that became unsustainable. And we started really wrestling with this idea that proximity matters and we should probably be very intentional about where we choose to buy our first house. Can it be close and to where we're serving and where we're spending a lot of time? And it's really hard, even with someone with good intentions. We think back and saying, like, we had an intentional missional desire to move into a particular neighborhood and even move into Williams Woodland. Like, we wanted to be a part of something. We want to be part of the transformation. And so we looked at things even then with the right heart, but as the object that you said. But realizing over the last 8 or 9 years that, wow, this has been far more about our own transformation in this than and about the people we get to meet and the relationships. And now we reflect back, really quickly after we moved in and saying, oh, this is home. This isn't. There's a big difference between wanting to do good in a neighborhood than being present in a neighborhood and allowing, to be a part of what's. And I'm curious if you've had similar experiences, especially maybe when you moved in to the way you guys look at the neighborhood now.
Yeah, I think that for me, when I was a renter, I may have viewed my neighbors a little differently than when I chose to own the home.
Okay.
I think that that may be a factor, because when a person's renting, there's this sense that this is a temporary situation, or it can feel that way. And as a result, we don't put the energy into building relationships, getting to know our neighbors, getting to know our neighbors' names, because we know we're moving on at some point in the perhaps near future. For example, I have a neighbor near me whom I've tried to get to know and to get to know their name, but I can tell from their body language and the way they respond to me that they're just passing through. And so it's very difficult for me to develop a relationship with them, because I think in their mind, they aren't going to be there for a long time. So they're not investing in the community. They don't come to the activities that we have. They don't chit-chat with the neighbor 2 doors down. They don't come to the neighborhood meetings and so forth.
So there is a big difference in the culture of a neighborhood between if you're renting or between owners, being an owner.
I think so. And I think that one reason why our particular neighborhood is a strong neighborhood is because 70% or so are owners. And so I think it becomes a real challenge when, like, 2 blocks down, the neighborhood changes and it's the opposite. It's 30% are owners and 70% renters. And I think the challenge to create community there is much more difficult.
Yeah. So having an ownership stake makes a huge difference
I believe it does.
In the state of a neighborhood and the health of a neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So in the 30 plus years that you've lived in Williams Woodland, how have you seen the neighborhood change?
It's been interesting because I've seen a generational shift in actual age. Okay. When I moved in, of course, I was one of the young people at that time, not anymore. But there were a lot of empty nester retirees who I've watched their homes sold to very young starting families, much like yourself. So I feel like the neighborhood in one respect has gotten younger. And also, I think that the amount of crime we still have crime, security is still an issue, but I don't feel like it's as bad as it had been when I first moved into the neighborhood. I think that the fact that in our particular neighborhood, it's has historic status, that's helped attract people with certain values that are investing in their homes and their property, and as a result, it's more stable than it had been when I first came.
Yeah. For neighbors that are interested, crime is always, a conversation that's constantly being had. Mm-hmm. Depending on whatever the crime is, there's this tendency that we end up becoming fearful in those situations. But as you and I have discussed, there's a difference between when crime is just outside the neighborhood, or when you understand that it's a bit targeted, or conflict in general. I'm curious if you would share a story, or if there's a story that comes to mind that illustrates like when something maybe negative is happening in the neighborhood. Like what is your first response, and how have you maybe come and approached it from a different place? And I remember you sharing about the story of the neighbors across the street.
Yeah, a couple weeks ago, now that it's gotten warmer out, we've had windows open, and so in the middle of the night, like 3 a.m, my wife and I are in bed, and we're hearing this yelling across the street from one of our neighbors. And my first reaction was, oh no, here we go. And so there was some loud conversation happening. Cars left. 20 minutes later, cars came back. More conversation, yelling, and that kind of thing. My first reaction was to just call the police and say, take care of this issue. They're bothering me. They're keeping me up. The second thought was to go across the street and let them know that what they did was keeping my wife and I awake, and we didn't appreciate that, and come on, be a better neighbor. Thankfully, I had a third thought, which I ended up running with, and that third thought was, I don't really even know these people because they had, this individual had just recently moved into that home. I didn't even know their name. And before I went with option 1 or 2, shouldn't I at least find out who they are?
Sure.
And that's what I did. That day, I went over across the street and I just introduced myself and found out who he was. Discovered that we knew a mutual friend who worked at the same place he works. Found out that he was watching children for his brother, and so it wasn't even the people I thought were making the noise. It was someone totally different. All that's to say that in the last few weeks, every time I see him, including today, when we're out, he looks at me and he smiles, big smile, and waves. And to be honest, we haven't had any problems ever since. Yeah. And I just think, what a shame had I gone with option 1 or 2, because that would have taken us a totally different direction as neighbors. And it would have been, we would have missed so much, because we have the potential of having a great relationship and having a lot of fun, frankly.
Yeah. So it sounds like making the choice to really move with the question that came to your mind and step out in kind of faith to maybe there's more to the story here with our neighbors.
Yeah, I don't know the facts, really.
Yeah. Therefore, but we move so emotionally at times because it's we were woken up or whatever.
Yeah, especially at night when you're not thinking real clearly.
I think that's one of such the great things about our neighborhood, or at least when I think what being a neighborhood neighbor looks like is those that take the time to like go and try to ask the questions and find the story before making a decision. And getting to know people. Like we're all dealing with life circumstances, and they can impact us at any time. We don't really get a choice.
Absolutely.
And when there's a story and we get to know that, it gives us permission to respond differently. To kind of wrap up, I'm curious, how would you answer the question, what does it mean to be a good neighbor?
Well, I think for me, it starts by me not viewing the people around me as simply objects. And by that I mean just people who live there, people who come and go, but to begin to actually see them as people who are valuable in and of themselves, and that when I interact with them and they with me, that our relationship brings even more value to our community. And so for me, it's actually seeing the people, not just viewing them as an object or the person that comes and goes, but actually seeing them, getting to know their name, beginning to understand who they are, hearing the stories of their life experience, and building a relationship. So I think that's really a challenge, because I don't always do that. I have my own agenda, and when I come out of that door of my house, I'm usually on a mission, going somewhere, doing something. But I need to take the time to walk across the street and have that conversation, because my life and theirs is going to be richer as a result.
Do you find that that more people want that kind of response for themselves and from their neighbors than maybe act that way? Do you find like deep down through those interactions when you do that, is that something we really want for ourselves, or do you think that that's kind of a unique thing?
I think there are some people who are content to be living their lives pretty independently and aren't, they may be introverts, they may simply not be wired to have yearning for interaction. But I think for most people, we have a real deep hunger for community, real community. I think that our world is full of pseudo-community, through social media and interaction on devices and all of that. I think there's a real hunger for real community. And so even the introvert or even the person wired a little differently, I think even they appreciate when there's an interaction, a genuine interaction with someone who truly cares about them and who they are.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Ed, thanks for your time today to come and share and be a neighbor. And most of all, thanks for being a good neighbor.
And you too.
It's inspiring to be able to walk around and see how you interact with other people and how you are leading and taking initiative in your own unique way that speaks to you. And I know that inspires a lot of us to kind of step in and take advantage and move forward with the things that are speaking to us. And so thanks for being a part of our series and kicking us off. This is great. Well, thanks for tuning in to the first episode of Neighboring, this podcast where we sit down with people like Ed and just ask, what does it mean to be a good neighbor? We have so much to learn from each other. And this whole idea of neighboring happens in all different places, not just the neighborhood. And so over the next 11 episodes, you'll learn from other people that are taking this to their workplace, to maybe their neighborhood, maybe in their family, or even the local club or organization they're in. So stay tuned, and we look forward to hearing what other people have to say about what it means to be a good neighbor.